Chapters 13 to 17 of Peace of Mind by Lucius Annaeus Seneca, translated by Aubrey Stewart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. Of Peace of Mind by Lucius Annaeus Seneca, translated by Aubrey Stewart. Chapters 13 through 17. Chapter 13. It was, I imagine, following out of this principle that Democritus taught that he who would live at peace must not do much business either public or private, referring, of course, to unnecessary business. For if there be any necessity for it, we ought to transact not only much, but endless business, both public and private. In cases, however, where no solemn duty invites us to act, we had better keep ourselves quiet. For he who does many things often puts himself in fortune's power, and it is safest not to tempt her often, but always to remember her existence, and to never promise oneself anything on her security. I will set sail, unless anything happens to prevent me. I shall be a praetor, if nothing hinders me. My financial operations will succeed, unless anything goes wrong with them. This is why we say that nothing befalls the wise man which he did not expect. We do not make him exempt from the chances of human life, but from its mistakes. Nor does everything happen to him as he wished it would, but as he thought it would. Now his first thought was that his purpose might meet with some resistance, and the pain of disappointed wishes must affect a man's mind less severely if he has not been at all events confident of success. Chapter 14. Moreover, we ought to cultivate an easy temper, and not become overfond of the lot which fate has assigned to us, but transfer ourselves to whatever other condition chance may lead us to, and fear no alteration either in our purposes or our position in life, provided that we do not become subject to caprice, which of all vices is the most hostile to repose. For obstinacy, from which fortune often wrings some concession, must needs be anxious and unhappy, but caprice, which can never restrain itself, must be more so. Both of these qualities, both that of altering nothing and that of being dissatisfied with everything, are enemies to repose. The mind ought in all cases to be called away from the contemplation of external things to that of itself. Let it confide in itself, rejoice in itself, admire its own works, avoid as far as may be those of others, and devote itself to itself. Let it not feel losses, and put a good construction even upon misfortunes. Zeno, the chief of our school, when he heard the news of a shipwreck, in which all his property had been lost, remarked, "Fortune bids me follow philosophy in lighter marching order." A tyrant threatened Theodorus with death, and even with want of burial. "You are able to please yourself," he answered. "My half pint of blood is in your power. For as for burial, what a fool you must be if you suppose that I care whether I rot above ground or under it." Julius Canus, a man of peculiar greatness, whom even the fact of his having been born in this century does not prevent our admiring, had a long dispute with Gaius, and when as he was going away, that Phalaris of a man said to him, "That you may not delude yourself with any foolish hopes, I have ordered you to be executed," he answered, "I thank you, most excellent prince." I am not sure what he meant, for many ways of explaining his conduct occur to me. Did he wish to be reproachful, and to show him how great his cruelty must be if death became a kindness? Or did he upbraid him with his accustomed insanity? For even those whose children were put to death, and whose goods were confiscated, used to thank him. Or was it that he willingly received death, regarding it as freedom? Whatever he meant, it was a magnanimous answer. Some one may say, after this Gaius might let him live. Canus had no fear of this. The good faith with which Gaius carried out such orders as these was well known. Will you believe that he passed the 10 intervening days before his execution without the slightest despondency? It is marvelous how this man spoke and acted, and how peaceful he was. He was playing at draughts, when the centurion, in charge of a number of those who were going to be executed, bade him join them. On the summons he counted his men and said to his companion, "Mind you do not tell a lie after my death and say that you won." Then turning to the centurion, he said, "You will bear me witness that I am one man ahead of him." Do you think that Canis played upon that draught board? Nay, he played with it. His friends were sad at being about to lose so great a man. "Why," he asked, "are you sorrowful? You are inquiring whether our souls are immortal, but I shall presently know." Nor did he up to the very end cease his search for truth, and raised arguments upon the subject of his own death. His own teacher of philosophy accompanied him, and they were not far from the hill on which the daily sacrifice to Caesar our God was offered, when he said, "What are you thinking of now, Canis? Or what are your ideas?" "I have decided," answered Canis, "at that most swiftly passing moment of all, to watch whether the spirit will be conscious of the act of leaving the body." He promised, too, that if he made any discoveries, he would come round to his friends and tell them what the condition of the souls of the departed might be. Here was peace in the very midst of the storm. Here was a soul worthy of eternal life, which used its own fate as a proof of truth, which when at the last step of life experimented upon his fleeting breath, and did not merely continue to learn until he died, but learned something even from death itself. No man has carried the life of a philosopher further. I will not hastily leave the subject of a great man, and one who deserves to be spoken of with respect. I will hand thee down to all posterity, thou most noble heart, chief among the many victims of Gaius. Chapter 15. Yet we gain nothing by getting rid of all personal causes of sadness, for sometimes we are possessed by hatred of the human race. When you reflect how rare simplicity is, how unknown innocence, how seldom faith is kept, unless it be to our advantage, when you remember such numbers of successful crimes, so many equally hateful losses and gains of lust, and ambition so impatient even of its own natural limits, that it is willing to purchase distinction by baseness, the mind seems, as it were, cast into darkness, and shadows rise before it as though the virtues were all overthrown, and we were no longer allowed to hope to possess them or benefit by their possession. We ought, therefore, to bring ourselves into such a state of mind that all the vices of the vulgar may not appear hateful to us, but merely ridiculous, and we should imitate Democritus rather than Heraclitus. The latter of these, whenever he appeared in public, used to weep, the former to laugh. The one thought of all human doings to be follies, the other thought them to be miseries. We must take a higher view of all things, and bear with them more easily. It better becomes a man to scoff at life than to lament over it. Add to this, that he who laughs at the human race deserves better of it than he who mourns for it, for the former leaves it some good hopes of improvement, while the latter stupidly weeps over what he has given up all hopes of mending. He who after surveying the universe cannot control his laughter shows, too, a greater mind than he who cannot restrain his tears, because his mind is only affected in the slightest possible degree, and he does not think that any part of all this apparatus is either important, or serious, or unhappy. As for the several causes which render us happy or sorrowful, let everyone describe them for himself, and learn the truth of Bion's saying, that all the doings of men were very like what he began with, and that there is nothing in their lives which is more holy or decent than their conception. Yet it is better to accept public morals and human vices calmly without bursting into either laughter or tears. For to be hurt by the sufferings of others is to be forever miserable, while to enjoy the sufferings of others is an inhuman pleasure, just as it is a useless piece of humanity to weep and pull a long face because someone is burying his son. In one's own misfortunes also, one ought so to conduct oneself as to bestow upon them just as much sorrow as reason, not as much as custom requires. For many shed tears in order to show them, and whenever one is looking at them their eyes are dry, but they think it disgraceful not to weep when everyone does so. So deeply has this evil been guided by the opinion of others, taken root in us, that even grief, the simplest of all emotions, begins to be counterfeited. Chapter 16. There comes now a part of our subject which is wont with good cause to make one sad and anxious. I mean when good men come to bad ends. When Socrates is forced to die in prison, Rutilius to live in exile, Pompeius and Cicero to offer their necks to the swords of their own followers, when the great Cato, that living image of virtue, falls upon his sword and rips up both himself and the republic, one cannot help being grieved that fortune should bestow her gifts so unjustly. What, too, can a good man hope to obtain when he sees the best of men meeting with the worst fates? Well, but see how each of them endured his fate, and if they endured it bravely, long in your heart for courage as great as theirs. If they died in a womanish or cowardly manner, nothing was lost. Either they deserved that you should admire their courage, or else they did not deserve that you should wish to imitate their cowardice. For what can be more shameful than that the greatest men should die so bravely as to make people cowards? Let us praise one who deserves such constant praises, and say, the braver you are, the happier you are. You have escaped all accidents, jealousies, diseases. You have escaped from prison. The gods have not thought you worthy of ill fortune, but have thought that fortune no longer deserved to have any power over you. But when any one shrinks back in the hour of death and looks longingly at life, we must lay hands upon him. I will never weep for a man who dies cheerfully, nor for one who dies weeping. The former wipes away his tears, the latter by his tears makes himself unworthy that any should be shed for him. Shall I weep for Hercules because he was burned alive, or for Regulus because he was pierced by so many nails, or for Cato because he tore open his wounds a second time? All these men discovered how at the cost of a small portion of time they might obtain immortality, and by their deaths gained eternal life. Chapter 17. It also proves a fertile source of troubles if you take pains to conceal your feelings and never show yourself to anyone undisguised, but, as many men do, live an artificial life in order to impose upon others. For the constant watching of himself becomes a torment to a man, and he dreads being caught doing something at variance with his usual habits, and indeed we can never be at our ease if we imagine that everyone who looks at us is weighing our real value. For many things occur which strip people of their disguise, however reluctantly they may part with it, and even if all this trouble about oneself is successful, still life is neither happy nor safe when one always has to wear a mask. But what pleasure there is in that honest straightforwardness which is its own ornament, and which conceals no part of its character? Yet even this life, which hides nothing from anyone, runs some risk of being despised. For there are people who disdain whatever they come close to. But there is no danger of virtue's becoming contemptible when she is brought near our eyes, and it is better to be scorned for one's simplicity than to bear the burden of unceasing hypocrisy. Still, we must observe moderation in this matter, for there is a great difference between living simply and living slovenly. Moreover, we ought to retire a great deal into ourselves. For association with persons unlike ourselves upsets all that we had arranged, rouses the passions which are at rest, and rubs into a sore any weak and imperfectly healed place in our minds. Nevertheless, we ought to mix up these two things, and to pass our lives alternately in solitude and among throngs of people, for the former will make us long for the society of mankind, the latter for that of ourselves, and the one will counteract the other. Solitude will cure us when we are sick of crowds, and crowds will cure us when we are sick of solitude. Neither ought we always to keep the mind strained to the same pitch, but it ought sometimes to be relaxed by amusement. Socrates did not blush to play with little boys. Cato used to refresh his mind with wine after he had wearied it with application to affairs of state, and Scipio would move his triumphal and soldierly limbs to the sound of music. not with a feeble and halting gait, as is the fashion nowadays, when we sway in our very walk with more than womanly weakness, but dancing as men were wont in days of old, on sportive and festal occasions, with manly bounds, thinking it no harm to be seen so doing, even by their enemies. Men's minds ought to have relaxation. They rise up better and more vigorous after rest. We must not force crops from rich fields, for an unbroken course of heavy crops will soon exhaust their fertility, and so also the liveliness of our minds will be destroyed by unceasing labor, but they will recover their strength after a short period of rest and relief, for continuous toil produces a sort of numbness and sluggishness. Men would not be so eager for this, if play and amusement did not possess natural attractions for them, although constant indulgence in them takes away all gravity and all strength from the mind. For sleep, also, is necessary for our refreshment, yet if you prolong it for days and nights together, it will become death. There is a great difference between slackening our hold of a thing and letting it go. The founders of our laws appointed festivals, in order that men might be publicly encouraged to be cheerful, and they thought it necessary to vary our labors with amusements, and, as I said before, some great men have been wont to give themselves a certain number of holidays in every month, and some divided every day into playtime and work time. Thus I remembered that great orator Asinius Pollio would not attend any business after the 10th hour. He would not even read letters after that time, for fear some new trouble should arise, but in those 2 hours used to get rid of the weariness which he had contracted during the whole day. Some rest in the middle of the day, reserve some light occupation for the afternoon. Our ancestors, too, forbade any new motion to be made in the Senate after the 10th hour. Soldiers divide their watches, and those who have returned from active service are allowed to sleep the whole night undisturbed. We must humor our minds and grant them rest from time to time, which acts upon them like food, and restores their strength. It does good also to take walks out of doors, that our spirits may be raised and refreshed by the open air and fresh breeze. Sometimes we gain strength by driving in a carriage, by travel, by change of air, or by social meals and a more generous allowance of wine. At times we ought to drink even to intoxication, not so as to drown, but merely to dip ourselves in wine, for wine washes away troubles and dislodges them from the depths of the mind, and acts as a remedy to sorrow as it does to some diseases. The inventor of wine is called Liber, not from the license which he gives to our tongues, but because he liberates the mind from the bondage of cares, and emancipates it, animates it, and renders it more daring in all that it attempts. Yet moderation is wholesome both in freedom and in wine. It is believed that Solon and Arcesilaus used to drink deep. Cato is reproached with drunkenness. But whoever casts this in his teeth will find it easier to turn his reproach into a commendation than to prove that Cato did anything wrong. However, we ought not to do it often, for fear the mind should contract evil habits, though it ought sometimes to be forced into frolic and frankness, and to cast off dull sobriety for a while. If we believe the Greek poet, it is sometimes pleasant to be mad. Again, Plato always knocked in vain at the door of poetry when he was sober, or, if we trust Aristotle, no great genius has ever been without a touch of insanity. The mind cannot use lofty language above that of the common herd, unless it be excited. When it has spurned aside the commonplace environments of custom and rises sublime, instinct with sacred fire, then alone can it chant a song too grand for mortal lips. As long as it continues to dwell within itself, it cannot rise to any pitch of splendor. It must break away from the beaten track, and lash itself to frenzy, till it gnaws the curb and rushes away bearing its rider to heights whither it would fear to climb when alone. I have now, my beloved Serenus, given you an account of what things can preserve peace of mind, what things can restore it to us, what can arrest the vices which secretly undermine it. Yet be assured that none of these is strong enough to enable us to retain so fleeting a blessing, unless we watch over our vacillating mind with intense and unremitting care. End of chapters 13 through 17. End of Peace of Mind by Lucius Annaeus Seneca, translated by Aubrey Stewart.